A woman abandoned in the forest with 3 small children finds salvation in the hands of an exiled knight, never imagining that together they would rewrite the destiny of an entire kingdom. Welcome to the Healed Emotions channel. Before we begin, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing deep romance stories that move and heal wounds. The autumn rain drummed against the narrow windows of the Mendoza cottage, each drop a reminder of debts that mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. Isadora pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching rivulets trace paths down the pane, much like the tears she refused to shed in her father's presence. "You understand what this means for our family." Ramon Mendoza's voice carried the weight of a man who had gambled everything on silk and spices, only to watch his fortune dissolve like salt in water. His weathered hands trembled as he poured wine into a pewter cup, the last of their decent silver having been sold months ago. Isadora turned from the window, her emerald eyes reflecting the firelight that danced across the modest room. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made merchants stumble over their words and nobles forget their manners. Auburn hair that caught light like burnished copper, and features that seemed carved by an artist who understood both strength and grace. "I understand that you speak of selling me like one of your bolts of cloth," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "It is not selling, child. It is survival." Her father's words hung heavy between them. "Prince Alric has noticed you. Do you comprehend what that means? The protection of the crown, elevation beyond anything our bloodline has ever known. Your children will want for nothing." The fire crackled, filling the silence that stretched between father and daughter. Outside, the kingdom of Eldoria slept under its blanket of rain, unaware that in this humble cottage, a young woman's fate was being decided by forces beyond her control. "And if I refuse?" The question escaped her lips before wisdom could silence it. Ramon's face hardened, aging a decade in the span of a heartbeat. "Then we lose everything. The creditors will seize what little remains, and your mother—" He gestured toward the small room where Elena Mendoza lay bedridden, her cough growing worse with each passing day. "She needs medicine we cannot afford, food we cannot buy." Isadora closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her small world closing in like a trap sprung by fate itself. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour. 8 solemn notes that seemed to count down the moments of her freedom. "When?" The single word emerged as barely a whisper. "The prince's envoy arrives tomorrow at dawn. You will be presented at court within the fortnight." That night, Isadora lay awake listening to her mother's labored breathing through the thin walls. The arrangement was simple enough in its cruelty. She would become Prince Alric's acknowledged mistress, bearing his children and receiving his protection in return. Not a wife, that honor was reserved for political alliances with foreign princesses, but something more than a common paramour, a recognized companion whose offspring would carry royal blood, even if not the royal name. The next morning arrived with deceptive beauty. Sunlight streamed through the cottage windows, painting everything in shades of gold that seemed to mock the darkness of the occasion. Isadora dressed in her finest gown, deep blue silk that had once been her grandmother's, altered to fit her slender frame. Her mother had insisted on braiding pearls into her hair, the family's last precious ornaments. "You look like a queen," Elena whispered, her voice paper-thin but warm with maternal pride. "I feel like a sacrifice," Isadora replied, then immediately regretted the words when she saw her mother's face crumple. The royal envoy arrived precisely at dawn, his crimson cloak brilliant against the grey morning mist. Sir Matthias was a man of middle years, with kind eyes that seemed apologetic for his errand. Behind him rode 2 guards in the prince's colours, their presence a reminder that this was not truly a request. "Lady Isadora," Sir Matthias bowed with genuine respect. "His Highness Prince Alric extends his warmest regards and hopes you will find the arrangements to your satisfaction." Arrangements. as if love and desire could be filed away like a merchant's contract. Isadora nodded gracefully, having practiced the gesture a dozen times in her mirror that morning. The journey to the palace took 3 days, winding through forests that blazed with autumn colors and villages where common folk paused in their labors to watch the small procession pass. At night, they stayed in roadside inns, where Isadora was treated with the deference due to one under royal protection. She found it both thrilling and terrifying, this glimpse of the power that would soon shelter her family. On the 3rd evening, as they crested a hill overlooking the capital city of Valdris, Isadora caught her first sight of the palace. It rose from the valley like something from a fairy tale, its towers reaching toward the stars, windows glowing like jewels in the twilight. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that this was truly a romantic adventure, that somewhere in those elegant halls a prince waited who might actually learn to love her. The illusion shattered the moment she met Prince Alric. He was handsome enough, with the refined features and golden hair of the royal bloodline, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had never wanted for anything and therefore valued nothing. When he looked at her, she felt assessed rather than admired, like a horse being evaluated for breeding potential. "You are as lovely as reported," he said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips in a gesture that should have been romantic but felt like a business transaction being sealed. "I trust you understand the nature of our arrangement?" "I do, Your Highness." "Excellent. You will be housed in the East Wing with servants at your disposal. Your family's debts have been settled, and your mother will receive the finest physicians in the realm." The pragmatic kindness stung worse than outright cruelty would have. At least cruelty would have given her something to hate. That first night in the palace, Isadora stood on the balcony of her appointed chambers, looking out over gardens that probably cost more to maintain than her father had ever earned. The luxury was overwhelming. Silk hangings, gilded furniture, a bed large enough for a family, everything she had ever dreamed of, and none of it felt real. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. "Enter!" she called, turning to see a young woman about her own age carrying a tea service. "I am Clara, my lady. I've been assigned as your personal maid." The girl had gentle brown eyes and hair that escaped her cap in rebellious curls. "I thought you might want something warm after your journey." Thank you." Isadora was grateful for the kindness in Clara's voice, the first genuinely warm human interaction she'd had since leaving home. As Clara poured the tea, she spoke quietly. "The palace can seem overwhelming at first, my lady, but you'll find your place here. His Highness, he's not unkind from what I've heard." "What have you heard?" Isadora found herself hungry for any information about the man who now controlled her destiny. Clara glanced toward the door, then leaned closer. "That he honors his agreements, that he provides well for those under his protection, and that he has little patience for court intrigue." It wasn't love, but it was something, a foundation upon which she might build a bearable life. The weeks that followed established a routine of careful cordiality. Prince Alric visited her chambers regularly, their encounters polite and functional. He spoke little during these visits, seeming to view intimacy as another royal duty to be discharged efficiently. Isadora learned to respond appropriately, to smile at the right moments, to make conversation about court gossip and palace life. When she discovered she was carrying his child 3 months after her arrival, Alric's satisfaction was evident, but restrained. "Excellent," he said, as if she had successfully completed a particularly challenging piece of embroidery. "You will have the finest care, naturally. Dr. Morel will attend you personally." "Thank you, Your Highness." She had learned that gratitude was always the expected response. The birth of their first son, whom they named Gabriel, brought a brief warmth to their relationship. Alric seemed genuinely pleased with the healthy boy, visiting more frequently and even smiling when Gabriel grasped his finger with tiny fists. "He has strong hands," the prince remarked. "He'll make a fine warrior someday." For a moment, watching Ulrich hold their son, Isidora allowed herself to hope that perhaps affection might grow between them, that their arrangement might evolve into something resembling love. But princes, she learned, were creatures of policy rather than passion. As Gabriel grew from infant to toddler, Ulrich's visits became routine again. When their second child, a daughter they named Sophia, was born 2 years later, his response was pleasant but distant. The birth of their third child, another son called Marcus, barely registered on his attention. By then, the whispers had begun. "The Princess of Elboran is said to be extraordinarily beautiful," Clara mentioned one morning as she helped Isidora dress. The maid's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes held a warning that made Isidora's stomach clench with sudden dread. "Indeed." Isidora kept her own voice level, though her hands trembled slightly as she fastened her necklace, a gift from Ulrich on Gabriel's first birthday. "They say negotiations for a marriage alliance have been progressing favorably. Her father controls 3 major ports and commands a fleet of 40 warships." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Isidora had always known this moment might come, had understood from the beginning that her position was dependent on political convenience. But understanding and accepting were vastly different things. "I see." She turned to face her reflection in the ornate mirror, noting how the morning light caught the fine lines that had begun to appear around her eyes. 3 pregnancies and 5 years of palace life had changed her, had worn away some of the fierce beauty that had first caught the prince's attention. That evening, she waited for Ulrich in her sitting room, her hands folded calmly in her lap, despite the storm raging in her chest. When he arrived, his manner was more formal than usual, the bearing of a man preparing to deliver unwelcome news. "Isidora." He remained standing, which told her everything she needed to know. "I'm sure you've heard the rumors by now." "I have heard many things, Your Highness. Perhaps you could clarify which rumors concern you?" A flash of something, irritation, respect, crossed his features. Direct, as always. "Very well. The negotiations with Elboran have concluded successfully. Princess Celeste and I will wed at the summer solstice." The words struck her like physical blows, each one carefully aimed. She had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed her response 100 times in the mirror, but preparation meant nothing when faced with the reality of abandonment. "I understand," she managed to say. "And what becomes of the children? Of Gabriel, Sophia, and Marcus?" "They will be provided for, naturally. Royal blood demands no less. Arrangements have been made for their education and eventual placement in suitable positions." Arrangements. Always arrangements. Never love, never consideration for the human hearts being shuffled like cards in a political game. "And me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Ulrich's face grew uncomfortable. "You have served the crown faithfully, Isidora. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten. A substantial settlement has been prepared, enough to ensure your comfort for the remainder of your life." "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. "There is a cottage in the woodland estate, quite charming, really, isolated enough to avoid any complications that might arise from your continued presence at court." The euphemism was elegant in its cruelty. She was to be hidden away like an embarrassing secret, tucked into the forest where the new princess would never have to acknowledge her existence. "When?" she asked, the single word containing all her defeat. "Within the fortnight. The princess arrives in 3 weeks, and it would be inappropriate for you to still be in residence." After he left, Isidora sat in her chair until the candles burned low, staring at the tapestry on the opposite wall. A hunting scene, where nobles on horseback pursued a fleeing deer. How fitting that she had spent 5 years staring at an image of her own fate. The days that followed passed in a blur of packing and preparation. The servants who had attended her for years now looked through her with the practiced blindness of those who served power rather than people. Only Clara remained constant, her loyalty a small flame of warmth in an increasingly cold world. "You don't have to come with us," Isadora told her maid as they folded the children's clothes into traveling chests. "I'm sure positions could be found for you elsewhere in the palace." Clara's hands stilled on the small shirt she was folding, one of Marcus's favorites, decorated with tiny embroidered horses. "My lady, where else would I go? These children need familiar faces around them. And you—" She looked up, her brown eyes fierce with determination. "You shouldn't face this alone." The cottage was exactly as Ulrich had described, charming, isolated, and utterly removed from everything that had given meaning to her life. Set in a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks and elms, it was the kind of place poets might describe as idyllic. To Isadora, it felt like a beautifully appointed prison. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. Gabriel, now 5, appointed himself protector of his younger siblings, while 3-year-old Sophia delighted in the freedom to run through the forest without palace guards hovering nearby. 1-year-old Marcus was too young to understand the change, content as long as his mother held him. For the first few months, life maintained a semblance of normalcy. A modest allowance arrived regularly, brought by a silent courier who never met Isadora's eyes. Clara managed the household with efficient grace, and the children grew strong and happy in the clean forest air. But isolation bred its own problems. Without the constant social stimulation of court life, Isadora found herself with too much time to think, to remember, to regret. The children asked increasingly difficult questions about their father, about why they had left the palace, about when they might return. She learned to deflect with stories and games, but each question was a small wound that never quite healed. The first winter was harsh, testing the cottage's defenses against wind and snow. The allowance, while adequate for basic needs, left little room for luxuries like additional firewood or warmer clothing for the rapidly growing children. Isadora found herself mending their clothes by candlelight, her fingers stiff with cold as she worked to make Gabriel's outgrown garments fit Marcus. Spring brought a brief respite and hope for better times ahead. The children played in the meadow behind the cottage, while Isadora tended a small garden, finding unexpected satisfaction in coaxing vegetables from the dark earth. Clara proved surprisingly knowledgeable about herbs and healing, skills learned from her grandmother in a village much like the one they now inhabited. But their isolation could not last forever. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked morning in late spring, his horse steaming from hard riding. Isadora watched from her window as he dismounted and approached the cottage, his royal livery instantly recognizable even through the downpour. "Lady Isadora Mendoza?" His voice was formal, devoid of the courtesy she had once commanded. "I am she. By order of His Royal Highness Prince Ulrich, your allowance is hereby terminated. Your tenancy of this property ends at summer's conclusion." The words struck her like lightning from a clear sky. "I don't understand. What reason? The prince's marriage to Princess Celeste has produced an heir. Your services are no longer required." The messenger's discomfort with his errand was evident, but he pressed on. "Furthermore, you are instructed to make no attempt to contact the royal family or approach the capital. Any violation of this directive will be met with appropriate consequences." He remounted and rode away without waiting for a response, leaving Isadora standing in the doorway with rain soaking through her shawl and despair soaking through her soul. "Mama?" Gabriel appeared at her elbow, his young face creased with worry. "Why are you crying?" She hadn't realized she was. Quickly wiping her cheeks, she forced a smile for her eldest son. "Just the rain, darling. Come inside before you catch cold." That night, after the children were asleep, she sat with Clara in the kitchen and shared the devastating news. Her faithful maid listened in silence, her face growing grimmer with each detail. "How long do we have?" Clara asked when Isadora finished. 3 months. Less, actually. "And money?" "What remains of this month's allowance? Perhaps enough for a few weeks if we're very careful." Clara stood and began pacing the small room, her mind clearly racing through possibilities. My village isn't far from here. 2 days' walk, maybe 3 with the children. My family might take us in temporarily. I can't ask that of them. 3 additional mouths to feed, and children who aren't their responsibility. You're not asking. I am. Clara's voice was firm. Besides, you have skills. You can read and write. You know numbers. The village priest might pay for lessons for the few children whose families can afford it. It was a slender hope, but hope nonetheless. They spent the remaining weeks preparing as best they could, selling what few valuable items Isadora possessed, preserving food from the garden, and gradually introducing the children to the idea of another move. The journey to Clara's village was harder than anticipated. Gabriel walked bravely beside his mother, but Sophia had to be carried much of the way, and Marcus seemed to sense the tension in the adults around him, fussing and crying more than usual. They camped rough the first night, huddled together under a tarp as summer rain drummed overhead. On the second day, as they struggled along a muddy forest path with their meager possessions, they encountered other travelers, 3 men on horseback who blocked their way with obvious intent. "Well, well," the leader drawled, his eyes traveling over Isadora with insulting familiarity. "What have we here? A lady fallen on hard times?" Clara stepped protectively in front of the children, while Isadora faced the men with as much dignity as she could muster. "We are peaceful travelers seeking passage. Please allow us to continue on our way." "Oh, I don't think so." The man's smile was predatory. "You see, we've been hearing interesting stories about a certain fallen woman who thinks she can hide in the forest and plot against her betters. I have no idea what you mean." "Don't you?" The second rider spoke now, his voice cultured despite his rough appearance. "Word is that the former royal whore has been filling children's heads with seditious ideas, teaching them to read forbidden books, spreading discontent among the common folk." The accusation was so ridiculous that Isadora almost laughed. Almost. But the deadly serious expressions on the men's faces choked the laughter in her throat. "That's absurd. I haven't even reached the village yet, let alone—" "Silence!" The leader's voice cracked like a whip. "By order of the crown, you are charged with sedition and the practice of forbidden arts. You will come with us to face judgment." Forbidden arts? The phrase sent ice through her veins. Witchcraft. They were accusing her of witchcraft. "No!" Gabriel suddenly broke free from Clara's protective grip and ran to his mother's side. "Don't hurt her. She's good. She takes care of us." The leader's expression softened fractionally as he looked at the boy, but when his gaze returned to Isadora, it was harder than before. "The children will be cared for by the church. You will come now, or we will take you by force." As rough hands seized her arms and bound them behind her back, Isadora caught one last glimpse of her children. Gabriel standing fierce and defiant despite his tears, Sophia clinging to Clara's skirts, and baby Marcus reaching his small arms toward his disappearing mother. The men's camp was a day's hard ride from where they had taken her. Isadora was thrown into a crude cage barely large enough for her to sit upright, her wrists already raw from the ropes that bound them. Round the fire she could hear her captors discussing their plans with casual brutality. "The villagers in Millbrook have been asking questions about the old knight," one was saying. "Seems some remember him fondly from before his exile." "All the more reason to make an example of his whore," another replied with a laugh that made Isadora's skin crawl. "Nothing like a good burning to remind people where their loyalties should lie." "She's not his whore, you fool. She's the prince's cast-off. But the connection serves our purpose just as well." A fourth voice, older and more authoritative, cut through the chatter. "Enough. We proceed as planned tomorrow. The charges are sedition and witchcraft. Plenty of evidence can be arranged. The trial will be swift, the verdict foregone." Isadora closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How had her life led to this moment? How had seeking shelter for her children resulted in accusations of witchcraft and treason? The night stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of men drinking and the distant howls of wolves. Each sound seemed to mock her helplessness, her complete inability to protect herself or return to her children. As dawn approached, she found herself thinking not of rescue, for who even knew where she was, but of whether Gabriel would remember her smile, whether Sophia would grow up knowing her mother had loved her, whether Marcus would have any memory of her at all. When the sun finally rose, painting the forest in deceptively peaceful shades of gold and green, the men broke camp with the efficiency of long practice. Isadora was hauled from her cage and thrown across a horse like a sack of grain, her bonds checked and tightened until her hands went numb. "Time to face justice, witch," the leader said with satisfaction. "The good people of Millbrook are eager to see you burn." As they rode toward the village, Isadora tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. She had lived through betrayal, abandonment, and the slow death of hope. Perhaps she could face this final indignity with grace. Perhaps, if she was very lucky, her children would never know the shameful manner of her death, but fate, it seemed, had different plans entirely. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers, muffling the sound of hoofbeats as the small procession approached the village of Millbrook. Isadora swayed with the motion of the horse, her body aching from the uncomfortable position and her wrists bleeding where the ropes had cut into her skin. Through the haze of exhaustion and fear, she could hear the increasing sounds of human activity, voices calling to one another, the lowing of cattle, the ring of hammer on anvil. The village square was already crowded when they arrived, word having spread quickly of the morning's entertainment. Isadora was hauled roughly from the horse and deposited before a makeshift tribunal of village elders, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and righteous anger. "Behold the witch," her chief captor announced with theatrical flourish, "she who would corrupt your children with forbidden knowledge and turn your hearts against your rightful rulers." A murmur ran through the crowd, some voices raised in condemnation, others expressing doubt or confusion. Isadora lifted her head with what dignity she could muster, meeting the stares of the villagers with steady eyes, despite the terror that clawed at her chest. "I am no witch," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I am a mother seeking shelter for her children. Whatever crimes you believe I have committed exist only in the minds of those who would see me destroyed." Lies! The accusation came from a woman near the front of the crowd, her face twisted with malicious excitement. "My cousin serves in the prince's guard. He told me all about you, the foreign witch who seduced his highness with dark magic and bore him cursed children." The crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. Isadora felt the mood shifting against her like a tide turning, carrying with it the very real possibility of violence. She had heard stories of what happened to women accused of witchcraft in remote villages, stories that ended in smoke and screaming. "Where are these children now?" demanded the eldest of the tribunal members, a white-haired man whose kind eyes seemed at odds with the proceedings. "If you are indeed their mother, where are they?" "Taken from me by these men," Isadora replied, gesturing as best she could with her bound hands toward her captors. "3 little ones, the youngest barely able to walk. They are somewhere in the forest with only a servant girl to protect them." Something in her voice, the raw anguish of a mother separated from her children, seemed to give some in the crowd pause. A few faces showed doubt now, sympathy even. "Enough!" The leader of her captors stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his sword hilt. "The woman is a known enemy of the crown, a spreader of sedition and corruption. The charges are clear, the evidence overwhelming. Why waste time with speeches when justice demands action?" "Because," a new voice said from the edge of the crowd, carrying clearly across the square despite its quiet tone, "justice without truth is merely murder dressed in fine clothes." Every head turned toward the speaker, and Isadora felt her heart stop. Standing at the periphery of the gathering was a tall figure in a worn brown cloak, his hood drawn up but not quite concealing the strong jaw and steel-grey eyes that had become familiar to her over the past months. But there was something different about him now, an authority, a presence that commanded attention despite his humble dress. "And who might you be to speak of justice?" sneered the tribunal leader. Though Isidora noticed, he kept his voice respectful. The figure stepped forward, pushing back his hood to reveal dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and a face that bore the weathered nobility of a man who had seen both glory and disgrace. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable cadence of high birth and military command. "I am Sir Edran Velaryon, Knight of the Realm, sworn protector of the innocent, defender of the righteous." His words fell into the sudden silence like stones into still water. "And I claim the right of testimony in this matter." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rose from the crowd as recognition dawned on faces both young and old. Some fell to their knees, others crossed themselves, and more than a few looked as though they were seeing a ghost. "Impossible," whispered the white-haired elder. "Sir Edran died years ago. The king declared him a traitor, stripped of lands and titles." "The king declared many things," Edran replied calmly. "Not all of them were true. I stand before you very much alive, and I claim the ancient right to speak in defense of this woman." Isidora's captors had gone pale, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. The leader's hand tightened on his sword, but he made no move to draw it, not when faced with a man whose reputation as a warrior was legendary even among his enemies. "You have no authority here, Exile," the man said, but his voice shook slightly. "This woman is charged with crimes against the crown. Your own position is questionable." "My position," Edran said, stepping fully into the circle, "is that of a man who has seen too much injustice masquerading as law. You speak of crimes against the crown. What crime has this woman committed save bearing children to a prince who abandoned her when political necessity demanded it?" The murmur from the crowd was different now, shocked, scandalized, but also sympathetic. Everyone knew stories of nobles who discarded their lovers when marriages were arranged, but to hear it spoken so plainly gave it a different weight. "She is a witch," the accusing woman shrieked. "She uses dark magic to corrupt—" "What magic?" Edran's voice cut across her words like a blade. "The magic of teaching children to read. The magic of healing herbs gathered from the forest, or perhaps the magic of loving her children enough to face exile and poverty rather than abandon them." He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice rising with passion. "I have lived among you for months now, watching, learning, seeing how you struggle against the indifference of those who claim to rule you. This woman sought only to build a life for her children, to contribute to your community with the skills she possessed. For this, she is dragged here in chains and accused of witchcraft by men who serve masters too cowardly to show their faces." The shift in the crowd's mood was palpable now. Faces that had shown suspicion and anger were beginning to show doubt, even sympathy. The accusations against Isidora were starting to sound hollow when placed against the knight's reasoned defense. "Sir Edran speaks truly," called out a voice from the crowd, a middle-aged woman holding a young child. "I remember the stories of how he defended us against the bandits, how he spoke for the common folk before the king." "Aye," agreed another voice, "and I remember how he was exiled for it, cast out for caring more about justice than politics." The leader of Isidora's captors was growing desperate now, his carefully laid plan unraveling before his eyes. "These are pretty words, but they change nothing. The woman stands accused of sedition. There have been reports." "Reports from whom?" Edran demanded. "Men whose faces you hide. Sources whose names you will not speak. What manner of justice condemns based on whispers and shadows?" He moved closer to Isidora now, and she could see the controlled fury in his grey eyes. Not at her, but at the situation, at the cruelty of men who would destroy an innocent woman to serve their hidden agenda. "I know this woman," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "I have seen her care for her children with a devotion that would shame the most pious saint. I have watched her tend the sick without thought of reward, teach the young without expectation of payment. If this is witchcraft, then we should pray for more such witches in the world." The white-haired elder spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "Sir Edron, your reputation for honor precedes you, even after all these years, but surely you understand our position. These men carry documents bearing royal seals. We cannot simply ignore—" "Can you not?" Edron's smile was grim. "Then let me make this simple for you. I hereby place this woman and her children under my personal protection. Any man who would harm her does so at his own peril." The challenge hung in the air, like the scent of lightning before a storm. Isidora's captors exchanged glances, clearly debating whether to press their case or withdraw while they still could. The crowd waited in tense silence, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. Finally, the leader of the accusers stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his sword hilt. "You overstep yourself, Exile. You have no authority to grant protection, no standing to make such claims." "Don't I?" Edron's own hand moved to his weapon, not the crude blade of a common soldier, but the elegant sword of a knight, its pommel bearing the ancient symbol of his house. "Then let us settle this matter in the old way. Trial by combat. Your strongest champion against me, with the woman's fate as the prize." The gasps from the crowd were audible now. Trial by combat was an ancient rite, rarely invoked, but still recognized by law. It was also, Isidora realized with growing horror, potentially a death sentence for the man who had just risked everything to defend her. "Edron, no," she whispered, but he either didn't hear or chose not to acknowledge her words. The leader of her captors was smiling now, a cruel expression that suggested he welcomed this turn of events. "Very well, Sir Edron, but when you fall, as you surely will, the woman burns regardless. Do you accept these terms?" "I do." As preparations began for the combat that would determine her fate, Isidora found herself staring at the man who had appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to voice. Sir Edron Velaryon, the legendary knight whose exploits had filled her childhood with stories of heroism and honor. The man who had been cast out for defending the innocent and was now preparing to risk his life for her. Why? The question burned in her mind, even as hope began to kindle in her heart. Why would he do this for a stranger, a fallen woman with no claim on his loyalty or protection? But as she watched him prepare for battle, checking his armor and testing the weight of his sword, she began to understand. This wasn't about her specifically. It was about justice, about standing against cruelty wherever it raised its head. She was simply the latest innocent to be threatened by the machinations of powerful men, and Sir Edron Velaryon had never been able to turn away from such a fight. The question now was whether his legendary skill with a blade could overcome the years of exile and hardship, whether the knight-errant could triumph one more time over the forces of darkness that seemed determined to consume everything good in the world. The village square had been hastily cleared to create a circle for combat, with the crowd pressing close on all sides, despite the danger. Isidora remained bound near the makeshift tribunal, her heart hammering as she watched Edron remove his worn cloak and check the leather straps of his armor. The gear showed its age, polished but patched, maintained with care but clearly bearing the marks of long use and limited resources. His opponent was a different matter entirely. The man who stepped forward as champion wore fine mail that gleamed in the morning sun, his sword blade catching light like captured fire. He was younger than Edron by perhaps a decade, with the thick build and confident swagger of a professional soldier accustomed to victory. "I am Captain Roderick of the King's Guard," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the square. "I serve the crown in all things, and I will not suffer a traitor to mock royal justice." "Then you serve a different crown than the one I once swore to protect," Edron replied quietly. drawing his own blade with a practiced motion that spoke of decades wielding such weapons. The crown I served valued honor above convenience, justice above political expediency. The two men circled each other warily, each taking the measure of his opponent. Roderick moved with the calculated aggression of a man who had won many such contests, while Edron displayed the fluid grace of someone for whom swordplay was less skill than instinct. "You were always too noble for your own good, Valarian," Roderick sneered, testing the air with quick cuts of his blade. "That's why you ended up living like a beggar in the woods while better men claimed the rewards you were too proud to take." "The better men?" Edron's voice remained calm, but his eyes had grown cold as winter steel. "Is that what you call those who would burn an innocent woman to serve their master's convenience?" The first clash came without warning, Roderick lunging forward with surprising speed for such a large man. His blade swept toward Edron's neck in a killing stroke, but the older knight was already moving, deflecting the attack with an economy of motion that spoke of hard-won experience. Steel rang against steel as the two men engaged in earnest, their blades weaving patterns of death in the morning air. Roderick fought with brutal efficiency, using his strength and reach to press his advantage, while Edron relied on technique and timing, turning his opponent's aggression against him. The crowd watched in breathless silence, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was no mere brawl or village dispute. This was combat between masters, each stroke precise and purposeful, each movement calculated to end in either victory or death. Isidora found herself unable to look away despite the horror of watching two men fight for her life. Every clash of blades sent jolts of terror through her heart, every near miss a reminder of how much depended on the outcome of this ancient ritual. "He's too old," she heard someone whisper behind her. "Years in exile will have dulled his reflexes." But as she watched, Isidora began to see something different. Where Roderick was spending energy on powerful attacks and aggressive advances, Edron was conserving his strength, letting his opponent come to him and using the younger man's momentum against him. It was the strategy of a warrior who had learned to think as well as fight. The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Both men bore minor wounds now, a cut on Roderick's sword arm, a thin line of blood along Edron's cheek where a thrust had come too close. Their breathing was labored, their movement slightly less crisp than at the beginning. Then Roderick made his mistake. Overconfident in his strength and frustrated by his inability to quickly dispatch the older knight, he committed fully to a massive overhead stroke designed to cleave Edron from crown to sternum. It was a powerful attack, potentially devastating if it landed. It never had the chance. Edron stepped aside at the last possible moment, letting the blade whistle past his ear, and drove his own sword upward in a perfectly timed riposte. The point took Roderick just below the ribs, sliding between the rings of his mail to find the vulnerable flesh beneath. The captain's eyes went wide with shock and pain. He staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stain on his surcoat with the expression of a man who had never truly believed he could be defeated. "Yield," Edron said quietly, not pressing his advantage, but keeping his sword ready. "You've fought well. There's no shame in acknowledging defeat." For a moment, it seemed as though Roderick might accept the offered mercy. But then his gaze fell on Isidora, and something ugly twisted his features. With a snarl of rage and desperation, he lunged forward in a final, suicidal attack. Edron's response was swift and final. His blade flicked out like a striking serpent, taking the captain through the heart. Roderick collapsed to the blood-stained earth of the village square, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, as if the very air were holding its breath. Then slowly, the crowd began to react, some cheering, others crossing themselves, all recognizing that they had witnessed something that would be remembered long after they were gone. By the ancient laws of combat, The white-haired elder announced in a voice that shook with emotion. "Sir Edron Valarian stands victorious. The charges against the woman are hereby dismissed." And the remaining accusers, suddenly looking very much like what they were, hired thugs rather than agents of justice, began backing toward their horses with the haste of men who had just seen their carefully laid plans crumble to dust. "This isn't over," their leader called out as he mounted. "There will be consequences for defying the crown's will." "There already have been," Edron replied, cleaning his blade with calm precision before sheathing it. "A good man lies dead, and an innocent woman was nearly murdered. If that's the crown's will, then perhaps it's time for better men to shape that will." The words carried the ring of prophecy, and more than a few in the crowd nodded agreement. The old order was cracking, its foundations weakened by too many injustices carried out in the name of political necessity. As the accusers rode away in defeat and humiliation, Edron approached where Isidora still knelt, her bonds cutting into her wrists. Without a word, he drew a small knife and carefully cut the ropes that had held her for so long. "Are you injured?" His voice was gentle now, the warrior's edge replaced by genuine concern. Isidora flexed her fingers, wincing as feeling returned to her hands. No, not seriously. But my children, they're still out there somewhere, with only Clara to protect them." "Then we'll find them," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Why?" The question escaped her before she could stop it. "Why did you risk your life for me? You don't even know me." Edron was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and hard-won wisdom. "Because once, long ago, I stood before a king and watched him condemn innocent people to death for the crime of inconveniencing his allies. I spoke out, and for my trouble I was stripped of everything I valued, my lands, my titles, my place in the world." He met her eyes directly now. "But I kept my honor and my conscience. Today, watching you face false accusations from hired murderers, I realized that sometimes keeping those things requires action, not just noble thoughts." The crowd was beginning to disperse now, the drama concluded, but the implications still sinking in. Isidora found herself looking at this man who had appeared like something from a legend, weathered, scarred, but radiating a strength that had nothing to do with the sword at his side. "I have nothing to offer you in return," she said quietly. "No lands, no title, no wealth, just 3 children and a woman whose reputation is already in ruins." "Then you have everything that matters," he replied. "Come, let's find your family." The search took the better part of the day, following the trail of 3 accusers through forest paths and across stream beds. Edron proved to be an accomplished tracker, reading signs in bent grass and broken twigs that would have been invisible to Isidora's untrained eye. As they walked, he told her fragments of his story, how he had lived these past years in a hidden cabin, helping travelers and protecting the defenseless, while the world forgot he existed. They found Clara and the children, as the sun was beginning to set, huddled together in a grove of birch trees where they had taken shelter. The reunion was tearful and joyous, with Gabriel throwing himself into his mother's arms, while Sophia clung to her skirts, and even baby Marcus seemed to understand that something important had happened. "I thought I'd lost you forever," Clara whispered, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "So did I," Isidora admitted. "But it seems we have a guardian angel." She introduced Edron to her children, watching as he knelt to their level and spoke to them with the same gentle respect he might show to adults. Gabriel, still suspicious of all men after his father's abandonment, slowly warmed to the knight's quiet manner. Sophia was charmed immediately by his stories of forest animals and hidden paths, and Marcus, with the innocent trust of the very young, simply held up his arms to be picked up. That night, they camped in a clearing Edron knew to be safe, with a small fire for warmth and protection. The children fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's adventures, while the adults sat talking quietly by the dying flames. "What happens now?" Isidora asked, staring into the glowing embers. "I can't return to the cottage. Those men made it clear that I'm no longer welcome there. And after today's events, I doubt there's anywhere in the kingdom that would be truly safe." "There's my cabin," Edron said after a moment's consideration. "It's hidden, well-supplied and defensible. Not luxurious, but it could shelter us all until we decide on something more permanent." "Us?" Isidora looked at him in surprise. "Sir Edron, I cannot ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." His voice was firm. "Those men today weren't acting on their own initiative. Someone with power and resources wanted you silenced, and they won't give up simply because their first attempt failed. You need protection, and your children need stability. I can provide both." It was a practical arrangement, born of necessity rather than sentiment. But as Isidora looked at this man who had risked everything to defend her, she felt something stirring in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude or relief. Something that whispered of possibilities she had thought lost forever. "Very well," she said quietly. "For the children's sake, I accept your offer." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she was accepting more than just shelter. The way Edron looked at her, not with the calculating assessment of Prince Alric, but with something that seemed almost like reverence, suggested that this arrangement might become more complicated than either of them anticipated. The cabin that had been Edron's solitary refuge for 3 years transformed over the following weeks into something resembling a home. What had once been a Spartan dwelling designed for a single occupant gradually filled with the warm chaos of family life. Children's laughter echoing off wooden walls, small clothes drying by the fire, the scent of Clara's cooking replacing the bachelor simplicity of Edron's previous meals. Isidora found herself marveling at the changes, not just in their surroundings, but in the children themselves. Gabriel, who had grown withdrawn and suspicious during their months of uncertainty, began to smile again under Edron's patient guidance. The knight taught him woodcraft and the basics of swordplay, treating the boy with the serious respect due to a future man, rather than dismissing him as merely a child. "Mind your stance," Edron instructed one morning, as Gabriel practiced with a wooden sword crafted specifically for his small hands. "Balance is more important than strength. A smaller warrior who keeps his feet can defeat a giant who overextends himself." Watching from the cabin doorway, Isidora smiled at the sight of her son's fierce concentration. Gabriel had been desperately in need of a positive male influence, someone who could show him what honor looked like when it wasn't wrapped in the selfish calculations of political convenience. Sophia had claimed Edron as her personal storyteller, demanding tales of brave knights and clever princesses each evening by the fire. He proved surprisingly gifted at spinning narratives that entertained while subtly teaching lessons about courage, kindness, and justice. Even Marcus, too young for formal instruction, followed the knight around like a devoted puppy, chattering in his limited vocabulary and receiving patient responses to his endless questions. But it was the quiet moments that affected Isidora most deeply. Edron chopping wood with methodical precision while humming old ballads under his breath. The careful way he tended the small injuries that active children inevitably acquired. His large hands, surprisingly gentle as he cleaned scraped knees and bandaged minor cuts. The sight of him reading by lamplight after the children were asleep, his weathered face softened by the golden glow. These domestic scenes stirred feelings she had thought dead. Not the passionate infatuation she had once felt for Prince Alric, but something deeper and more enduring. The quiet appreciation that grew between two people who had both known loss and found unexpected comfort in each other's company. "You're staring again," Clara observed one evening as they prepared dinner together, her voice holding the fond exasperation of a sister rather than a servant. "I don't know what you mean," Isidora replied, though she could feel warmth rising in her cheeks. "Of course you don't." Clara's smile was knowing. Just as you don't notice how he watches you when he thinks no one is looking, or how he's taken to finding excuses to work near the cabin when you're hanging laundry. Isadora's hands stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. Clara, that's not... We have an arrangement, nothing more. He offered shelter out of charity, and I accepted out of necessity. Charity? Clara laughed softly. My lady, I've seen charity. This isn't it. The way that man looks at you. Dai, she shook her head, still smiling. That's something entirely different. Before Isadora could respond, the subject of their conversation entered the cabin carrying an armload of firewood. His eyes found hers immediately, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Then Gabriel burst through the door behind him, chattering excitedly about a deer he had spotted near the stream, and the moment passed. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and Clara had retired to her small room, Isadora found herself alone with Edren by the dying fire. These quiet hours had become precious to her, a time when they could speak freely, without little ears listening to every word. Gabriel is improving rapidly with his sword work, Edren commented, banking the coals for the night. He has natural balance and good instincts. He adores you, Isadora said softly. All the children do. They've never had anyone treat them with such respect. They're good children. Credit for that belongs to their mother. The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest, but also brought with it a familiar pang of old pain. Their father never saw them as anything but political assets. Even when they were tiny, he spoke of Gabriel's future usefulness to the crown, of Sophia's eventual marriage value. Alric was a fool. The words were spoken quietly, but with conviction that brooked no argument. Isadora looked at him in surprise. It was the first time he had spoken the prince's name, the first acknowledgement of the specific details of her past that had led her to this moment. "You knew?" she asked. "I suspected from the beginning. The timing of your exile, the children's ages, certain physical characteristics." He shrugged. "It wasn't difficult to deduce. What I couldn't understand was how any man could discard such a treasure for political advantage." The word treasure hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings neither was quite ready to speak aloud. Isadora felt her heart begin to race, recognizing the precipice they were approaching. "Edren," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the confused tangle of her feelings. "I know," he said gently. "It's too soon, too complicated. You've been hurt enough for one lifetime, and I have little to offer beyond a hidden cabin and a tarnished name." "That's not what I was going to say." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected in his grey eyes. "What were you going to say?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Isadora found herself thinking of Prince Alric, of the calculated distance he had maintained even in their most intimate moments, of the way he had looked at her as a possession to be managed rather than a person to be cherished, of how hollow she had felt despite being surrounded by luxury and status. "I was going to say that I've never felt safer than I do here," she said finally. "Not because of the hidden location or the protection you provide, but because when you look at me, I see myself reflected as someone worthy of respect. Someone whose thoughts and feelings matter." The admission left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. But the expression that crossed Edren's face, wonder, tenderness, and something that might have been hope, made the risk worthwhile. "Isadora," he said, her name a prayer on his lips, "you are the strongest, most courageous woman I have ever known. What you've endured, what you've sacrificed for your children. You humble me." And they were sitting closer now, though neither could have said who had moved first. The space between them seemed to thrum with possibility, with all the words they hadn't yet spoken and all the dreams they hadn't dared to voice. "I don't want to be your charity case," she whispered. I need to know it's not just pity that moves you." "Pity?" His hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle but sure. "Isadora, What I feel for you has nothing to do with pity. You've awakened something in me I thought died years ago. Hope, the belief that perhaps I wasn't meant to live out my days alone in exile. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the calculated possession Prince Alric had claimed from her. This was reverent, questioning, offering rather than taking. It spoke of patience and tenderness, of a man who understood that trust was earned rather than demanded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, both aware that they had crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. "What happens now?" Isidora asked, echoing the question that had haunted her for months. "Now," Edron said, pulling her closer until she could rest her head against his shoulder. "We take each day as it comes. We build something together, not because we have to, but because we choose to." Outside the cabin, night winds whispered through the forest, carrying with them the promise of changing seasons. Inside, two wounded souls found healing in each other's arms, while three children slept peacefully under the protection of love that asked for nothing and offered everything. The arrangement born of necessity was becoming something far more precious, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the quiet miracle of finding home in another person's heart. But even as Isidora allowed herself to hope for the first time in years, a part of her remained alert to the possibility of loss. She had learned too well that happiness was fragile, that the powerful could destroy the innocent on a whim. Somewhere beyond the safety of their hidden refuge, forces were already stirring that would test their newfound love in ways neither could imagine. For now, though, there was this: the warmth of Edron's arms around her, the soft breathing of her children in the next room, and the radical idea that perhaps, after all the pain and abandonment, she might finally have found where she belonged. Spring arrived early that year, painting the forest in brilliant shades of green and filling the air with the songs of returning birds. Isidora had begun to believe that perhaps their hidden life could continue indefinitely, that the world beyond their small clearing might simply forget they existed and leave them in peace. That illusion shattered on a warm morning in late April, when Gabriel came running from the stream, his young face pale with excitement and fear. "Mama!" he called breathlessly. "There are riders on the old road, many of them, with banners." Edron was at Isidora's side instantly, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. "How many? Could you see their colors?" "At least 20, Gabriel panted. "Maybe more. Red and gold banners with a crown. The royal colors." Isidora felt ice form in her stomach, all her newfound peace crumbling at the implications. "They've found us." "Not necessarily," Edron said, though his expression was grim. "The old road leads to several villages. They might be passing through on other business." But even as he spoke the words, they both knew it was false hope. Royal forces didn't travel in large numbers without specific purpose, and after the events at Millbrook, there was only one logical explanation for their presence in this remote area. "Clara," Isidora called, her voice sharp with urgency. "Gather the children's things. Only what we can carry." The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Idran disappeared into the forest to scout the approaching force, while the women packed essentials into traveling bundles. The children, sensing the adults' anxiety despite efforts to shield them, grew clingy and fretful. "Where are we going now?" Sophia asked, her large eyes bright with unshed tears. "I like it here. I don't want to leave." "I know, darling," Isidora soothed, though her own heart was breaking. "Sometimes we have to go on adventures even when we'd rather stay home." When Edron returned near midday, his face was set in grim lines. "It's Prince Alric himself, leading a force of 30 mounted soldiers. They're making camp at the crossroads, close enough to block all the main routes out of the area." The name of her former lover hit Isidora like a physical blow. She had known this moment might come, had tried to prepare herself for it, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that mere possibility never could. "What does he want?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "You, the children. Perhaps me as well, for the humiliation at Millbrook. Edren's jaw tightened. There are also rumors circulating, stories about the witch woman who corrupts children with forbidden learning, about the exiled knight who protects her. Someone has been spreading tales designed to justify whatever action they plan to take. The same someone who arranged the false accusations before, Clara said quietly. My lady, there are forces at work here beyond simple personal vendetta. Isadora sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of inevitability. Every time she tried to build a new life, every time she found a measure of peace, the past reached out with iron claws to drag her back into darkness. I should go to him, she said finally. If it's me he wants. Perhaps... No. Edran's voice cut across her words like a blade. That way lies only death. Yours, and probably the children's as well. Whatever story he's told to justify this expedition, it won't allow for loose ends. Then what do you suggest? We can't run indefinitely, not with 3 young children, and I won't see them suffer because of choices I made. Idren was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant with thought. When he spoke, his voice carried the steel of decision. We don't run. We go to ground, wait for them to make their move, then strike where they don't expect it. What do you mean? Prince Alric is many things, but he's not a soldier. He'll expect you to flee in panic, probably toward one of the larger towns where you might seek sanctuary. He won't expect you to circle back and approach from behind. Clara looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Sir Edren, with respect, that sounds like madness. You're talking about 3 adults and 3 children against 30 armed soldiers. I'm talking about using the forest itself as our ally, he replied calmly. This is my home ground. I know every path, every hiding place, every advantage the terrain offers. More importantly, I know something Alric doesn't. What's that? His smile was grim, but determined. The village of Millbrook lies just beyond the crossroads. The same village where I revealed my identity to save Isadora from false accusations. The same village whose people remember what it means to stand against injustice. Understanding dawned on Isadora's face. You mean to rally them? I mean to give them the choice. Alric represents everything they've suffered under, the casual cruelty of nobles who see common folk as expendable. If they stand with us, we have a chance. If not, he shrugged. At least we'll have tried. The plan was audacious, to the point of seeming suicidal. But Isadora found herself nodding agreement. She was tired of running, tired of allowing other people to dictate the terms of her existence. If this was to be her final stand, she would meet it on her own terms. They spent the afternoon in careful preparation. Edren led them through hidden paths to a position overlooking the royal camp, where they could observe the enemy's movements without being detected. From their concealed vantage point, Isadora caught her first glimpse of Prince Alric in nearly a year. He looked older, his golden hair showing traces of silver at the temples, and his face bearing the soft lines of a man who had grown accustomed to luxury. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of nobility, directing his men with casual authority, while showing no awareness that he was being watched. He seems different, Isadora murmured, studying the man who had once held such power over her heart. Power changes people, Edren replied quietly, usually not for the better. They watched as the royal force settled into their temporary camp, noting patrol patterns and guard rotations. Alric had positioned his men well. Any conventional escape route would lead directly into their hands. But Edren's plan didn't rely on conventional thinking. As night fell, they began their careful approach to Millbrook, moving through the forest like shadows while the children slept in their parents' arms. The journey took most of the night, following game trails and hidden paths that only someone intimately familiar with the terrain could navigate in darkness. Dawn was breaking as they reached the outskirts of the village, and Isadora felt her heart lift at the sight of smoke rising from cottage chimneys and the sound of everyday life beginning. Whatever happened, they had made it this far. Edron left them hidden in a grove of apple trees while he went to make contact with the village elders. The wait seemed endless, filled with the constant fear that royal soldiers might appear at any moment. But when the knight returned, his expression held something that might have been hope. "They'll see us," he reported. "The headman remembers the trial, remembers what we said about justice and truth. He's called a gathering for midday." "And if they refuse to help?" Isadora asked. "Then we continue as planned, but with heavier odds." His hand found hers, warm and steady. "But I don't think they will. These people have suffered too much under noble indifference to ignore this chance for something better." The midday gathering was held in the village square, the same place where Isadora had faced false accusations and Edron had revealed his true identity. But the mood now was different, charged with possibility rather than fear. When Edron stepped forward to address the assembled villagers, he spoke not as a knight addressing his inferiors, but as one person appealing to the conscience of others. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "you know why we've come. Prince Alric camps at your gates with 30 soldiers, seeking to drag away a woman and her children for the crime of inconveniencing his politics. He brings with him the same arrogance, the same casual cruelty that has ground you down for generations." A murmur ran through the crowd, some voices expressing fear, others anger. "I won't ask you to risk yourselves for strangers," Edron continued, "but I will ask you to remember what we spoke of before, about justice, about truth, about the difference between law and right. This woman stands accused of no real crime, save bearing children to a man who found them inconvenient. Is that justice?" An old woman near the front of the crowd raised her voice. "What would you have us do, Sir Edron? We're farmers and craftsmen, not soldiers. How can we stand against royal troops?" "By standing together," he replied simply, "by refusing to bow to injustice, simply because it wears a crown. Alric's power comes from the belief that he can act without consequences. Take away that belief, and he becomes just another man with too high an opinion of himself." The debate that followed was passionate but brief. These people had indeed suffered under noble indifference, had watched their children go hungry while taxes funded royal luxuries, had buried fathers and sons in wars, fought for causes they neither understood nor benefited from. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close. "Then it's decided," the headman announced, his weathered face set with determination. "We stand with Sir Edron and Lady Isadora. May God have mercy on us all." As the villagers dispersed to make their preparations, Isadora found herself overwhelmed by the realization that dozens of people were willing to risk everything for her. A fallen woman with no claim on their loyalty except the basic human right to justice. "Why?" she asked the headman as he passed. "Why would you do this for us?" He paused, his kind eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. "Because, my lady, sometimes the right thing to do is also the necessary thing. Your knight there reminded us of who we used to be before we learned to accept injustice as inevitable. Perhaps it's time we remembered." The confrontation was coming, and with it the test of whether love and honor could triumph over power and politics. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Isadora felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. The confrontation came at dawn on the third day, when Prince Alric's patience finally exhausted itself. His scouts had found the royal camp empty, except for the sentries they had overwhelmed. 30 armed men simply vanished into the morning mist, leaving behind only questions and growing unease. Isadora stood in the village square surrounded by 24 farmers and craftsmen armed with whatever weapons they could find. Scythes, hammers, hunting bows, and the occasional inherited sword. Against 30 professional soldiers, it should have been a massacre. But there was something in their faces, something that spoke of people who had finally decided to stop accepting the unacceptable. Edron positioned himself at her right side, his sword drawn and ready. To her left stood the village headman, gripping a crossbow with hands that shook slightly but held steady. Behind them, the children waited with Clara in the relative safety of the church, though Isadora knew that if this went badly, there would be no safety anywhere. The royal force appeared at the edge of the square, like something from a nightmare. Armored riders on war horses, their weapons gleaming in the early light. At their head rode Prince Alric, resplendent in cloth of gold and crimson silk, every inch the picture of royal authority. When he saw Isadora standing defiant among the villagers, his expression shifted through surprise, anger, and something that might have been admiration before settling into cold calculation. "Lady Isadora Mendoza," he called, his voice carrying easily across the square. "You have led us quite a chase. I trust you're prepared to be reasonable now." "That depends, Your Highness," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "On your definition of reasonable." Ulrich's smile was thin and humorless. "Reasonable would be acknowledging that this charade has gone far enough. You will return with me to face the charges that have been brought against you. Your children will be placed in appropriate custody while their futures are decided." "What charges?" Edron demanded, stepping forward. "Sedition? Witchcraft? The same false accusations that were disproven at the trial by combat?" "Ah, Sir Edron Valarion." Ulric's attention shifted to the knight, his tone taking on a mocking edge. "Still playing the noble hero, I see. Still believing that honor matters more than reality." "Honor is reality," Edron replied quietly. "Everything else is just noise." The prince's laugh was genuinely amused. "How delightfully naive. Tell me, Sir Knight, what do you think happens to villages that harbor enemies of the crown? What becomes of simple farmers who take up arms against royal authority?" The threat hung in the air like poison, and Isadora felt the resolve of some villagers begin to waver. This was what she had feared, that her presence would bring destruction down on innocent people who had only tried to help. "Perhaps," she said, taking a step forward, "we could discuss this reasonably. I will come with you willingly if you guarantee the safety of these people and my children." "No." Edron's voice was sharp with command. "We've already tried that path. It leads only to death disguised as justice." "The knight speaks wisely," said a new voice from the edge of the square. All heads turned to see an elderly man emerging from the morning shadows, a figure bent with age, but radiating an authority that made even Prince Alric pause. "Father Benedict," the headman whispered, awe evident in his voice. Isadora had heard of the old priest, a man whose reputation for wisdom and holiness extended far beyond this remote village. He had served here for 30 years, tending to his flock with a devotion that had earned him reverence from noble and commoner alike. "Your Highness," Father Benedict said, approaching with slow but steady steps, "I wonder if you would permit an old man to speak." Alric looked annoyed, but nodded curtly. Even princes were cautious about openly disrespecting the church. "Thank you." The priest's voice was soft, but carried clearly in the morning air. "I have lived in this village for 3 decades, Your Highness. I have baptized the children here, married their parents, buried their grandparents. I know these people as well as any man can know his neighbors." He paused, his faded eyes surveying the assembled crowd with obvious affection. "They are not rebels or traitors," he continued. "They are simple folk who work hard, pray honestly, and try to live by the teachings of Christ. But they are also people who have learned the difference between law and justice, between authority and righteousness." "What is your point, priest?" Ulric's patience was clearly wearing thin. "My point, Your Highness, is this. When good people feel compelled to take up arms against those who claim to rule them, perhaps the fault lies not with the people, but with the rulers." The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Even the prince's soldiers seemed affected by the old man's quiet dignity. Father Benedict continued, addressing not just Alric, but the entire assembly. "This woman you seek to condemn, I have spoken with her, observed her actions. She has taught children to read, tended the sick without thought of reward, shown kindness to those who had none to give in return. If these are crimes, then we live in a world where virtue itself has become criminal. She is a disruption to the natural order. One of Ulrich's advisors spoke up, a thin man whose face held the calculating coldness of a born politician. Her very presence undermines proper authority. Does it? The priest asked mildly. Or does it reveal the emptiness of authority that rests on nothing more than inherited title and the threat of force? The question struck like lightning. Isidora could see its effect rippling through both the villagers and the royal soldiers, forcing each person to examine their own assumptions about power and legitimacy. Prince Ulrich's face had grown red with barely controlled anger. Enough of this philosophical prattling. I am the prince of this realm, ordained by God and crowned by law. I will not be lectured by a country priest about the nature of authority. And yet, Father Benedict replied with infuriating calmness, here you stand with 30 armed men, facing a woman with 3 children and a handful of farmers. If your authority is so absolute, why do you need so many swords to enforce it? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Several of the royal soldiers exchanged glances, and Isidora could see doubt beginning to creep into their expressions. These were professional warriors, but they were also men with families, men who understood the difference between duty and brutality. Because, Ulrich said through gritted teeth, sometimes examples must be made. Sometimes the greater good requires harsh measures. The greater good? Idrun's voice was contemplative, as if he were tasting the words. Tell me, Your Highness, how does destroying a woman and her children serve the greater good? How does burning villages and terrorizing farmers make the realm stronger? It maintains order, Ulrich snapped. It prevents chaos. No, said a voice from among the royal soldiers, a grizzled sergeant whose weathered face spoke of decades of service. It creates chaos. I've served the crown for 20 years, Your Highness, and I've seen what happens when fear becomes the only tool of governance. It breeds resentment, rebellion, and ultimately revolution. The prince wheeled his horse to face the man who had dared to contradict him. Sergeant Matthias, you forget yourself. Do I? The old soldier's voice was respectful but firm. I remember my oath, Your Highness, to protect the innocent, defend the realm, and serve justice. Looking at this woman and these people, I'm having trouble seeing where justice lies in what we're being asked to do. A murmur of agreement ran through the ranks of soldiers, and Ulrich's face went white with shock. This was rebellion, not from peasants or exiles, but from his own men. You dare, he began, but Father Benedict's voice cut across his words. Your Highness, perhaps this is a moment for reflection rather than anger. When good men begin to question orders, it is rarely because they have forgotten their duty. More often it is because they remember it too well. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, balanced on the edge of violence. Isidora could feel the tension in every person present, the sense that the next word spoken might determine whether this ended in bloodshed or something approaching justice. It was then that Gabriel chose to act. The 5-year-old boy broke away from Clara's protective grip and ran into the square, his small figure darting between the adults until he reached his mother's side. Before anyone could react, he had wrapped his arms around Isidora's waist and was glaring up at Prince Ulrich with the fearless indignation that only children could manage. You made my mama cry, he announced loudly. You went away and left us all alone, and now you want to hurt her more. That's not fair. The simple accusation, delivered with a child's perfect honesty, struck the assembly like a thunderbolt. Here was truth stripped of all political calculation, all sophisticated justification. A little boy calling out the man who had abandoned his family. Ulrich stared down at Gabriel, his son, though he had never acknowledged him, and for a moment his composure cracked entirely. Isidora saw something flicker across his features, guilt, perhaps, or recognition of what he had lost in his pursuit of political advantage. Gabriel, he said quietly, his voice different now, more human. You don't understand the complexities. I understand that you left us, Gabriel shot back with devastating directness. Mama said you had important things to do, but Marcus was sick and Sophia was scared, and you never came back, not even to see if we were all right. The silence that followed was profound. Even the morning birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if the very air held its breath. Prince Alric sat frozen on his horse, faced with the one accusation he couldn't answer with force or political maneuvering, the simple truth of a child's hurt. It was Sergeant Matthias who broke the silence, his gruff voice gentler than Isadora had heard it. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "perhaps it's time to consider that some things matter more than politics." Slowly, almost reluctantly, Alric dismounted. He approached Gabriel with careful steps, as if the boy might flee at any sudden movement. When he knelt to bring himself to the child's eye level, his golden hair caught the morning light in a way that made the family resemblance unmistakable. "You're right," he said simply. "I did leave you. I made choices that hurt you and your mother and your brother and sister. I told myself it was necessary, that I was serving a greater purpose, but—" He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "But maybe I was just being a coward." Gabriel studied his father's face with the serious intensity of childhood. "Are you sorry?" The question hung between them, weighted with more than any 5-year-old could possibly understand, but somehow cutting straight to the heart of everything. "Yes," Alric whispered, "I am sorry. It wasn't enough. Couldn't possibly be enough to heal the wounds his abandonment had caused. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement of responsibility that Isadora had never expected to hear. "Your Highness," Father Benedict said gently, "there is still time to choose differently, still time to let mercy triumph over pride." Alric remained kneeling for a long moment, his hand hovering near Gabriel's face, as if he wanted to touch his son, but didn't dare. When he finally stood, his expression had changed. Not transformed, but somehow clarified. "The charges are dropped," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Lady Isadora, you are free to go where you will, to live as you choose. The children—" He paused, looking down at Gabriel again. "The children remain with their mother, where they belong." A collective exhale ran through the assembled crowd, as if everyone had been holding their breath. Isadora felt her knees go weak with relief, and only Edron's steadying hand kept her upright. But Alric wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "this village has shown me something today. You have reminded me that true authority comes not from fear, but from respect. Not from the power to compel, but from the wisdom to inspire." He looked directly at Father Benedict. "Perhaps it's time the crown remembered that lesson as well." The transformation in the prince was subtle but unmistakable. He stood straighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. When he spoke again, it was with something approaching his old charm, but tempered now with a gravity that had been absent before. "Sir Edron," he said, turning to the knight, "I hereby restore your titles and lands, with the crown's apology for the injustice you suffered. The realm has need of men who value honor above convenience." Edron bowed formally, but his eyes remained wary. "Your Highness is generous. But I have found my place here, among people who understand the difference between service and servitude." "Then serve them," Alric replied. "The position of Lord Protector of the Western Marches is vacant. The crown would be honored if you would accept the appointment." It was an elegant solution, giving Edron official authority to protect the region while allowing him to remain in the community he had come to love. Isadora saw the knight's surprise, followed quickly by understanding and acceptance. "I am honored by your Highness's confidence," Edron said formally. "I accept the appointment." As the royal force prepared to depart, Alric approached Isadora one final time. The conversation was private, their voices too low for others to hear, but Isadora's posture remained dignified throughout. When they finished speaking, the prince turned to his children, spending a few moments with each one, his manner gentle but careful. like a man learning how to be a father far too late. Before he mounted his horse, he addressed the assembled villagers one last time. "You have taught me something valuable today," he said, "that the strongest kingdoms are built not on fear, but on the freely given loyalty of free people. I will not forget this lesson." As the royal procession disappeared into the forest, the village square erupted in celebration, but Isidora found herself strangely calm, standing in the center of the jubilation with Edran's arm around her waist and her children pressed close against her sides. "What did he say to you?" Edran asked quietly. Isidora smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He asked for my forgiveness, and he promised that the children would always have his protection, even if they never need it." "And did you forgive him?" She considered the question seriously. "I forgave him for my own sake, not his. Hatred is too heavy a burden to carry when there's so much joy to be found in living." That evening, as the village celebrated with an impromptu festival, Edran and Isidora walked hand in hand through the apple grove where they had once hidden in fear. The trees were heavy with blossoms, their white petals drifting on the evening breeze like snow. "What happens now?" Isidora asked, the same question that had haunted her for so long, but asked now with anticipation rather than dread. "Now we build something new," Edran replied. "A school, perhaps, where children can learn regardless of their birth. A place where justice is more than just a word spoken in grand halls." "And us?" she asked softly. "What becomes of us?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "That depends entirely on what you want to become." The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Around them, the sound of celebration drifted through the evening air, laughter and music, and the voices of people who had discovered their own strength. "I want to choose," Isidora said finally. "For the first time in my life, I want to make a choice based on my own heart, rather than someone else's need." "Then choose," Edran said simply. When she kissed him, it was with the full knowledge that this time, no one could take her happiness away unless she allowed it. This time, love was not a transaction, but a gift freely given and joyfully received. 6 months later, during the harvest festival, Sir Edran Velaryon knelt before Lady Isidora Mendoza in the village square, not as a knight before his lady, but as a man before the woman he loved. Around them, the entire community gathered to witness their vows. Children from the school Isidora had founded scattering flower petals while their parents cheered. Gabriel stood proudly at his mother's side, appointed as ring-bearer and taking his duties with the seriousness of a future lord. Sophia danced with excitement, her small hands clapping in delight. And Marcus, now steady on his feet, toddled between the adults with the confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and security. When Father Benedict pronounced them husband and wife, the celebration that followed lasted until dawn. But for Isidora and Edran, the real joy lay not in the ceremony, but in the knowledge that they had built something lasting. Not just a marriage, but a community. Not just love, but justice. Not just a home, but a place where others could find their own hope. As the sun rose over the village of Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Lady Isidora Velaryon stood in the doorway of her cottage, with her husband's arms around her and her children at her feet. She had travelled a long road from the desperate woman abandoned in the forest to this moment of perfect contentment. She had learned that true strength came not from titles or wealth, but from the courage to stand for what was right. That love was not something to be earned through sacrifice, but something to be shared through choice. And that sometimes the greatest victories were won not through force of arms, but through the simple refusal to let cruelty triumph over kindness. The kingdom of Eldoria would remember this story for generations, not as a tale of royal scandal, but as something far more precious. A reminder that even in the darkest times, honor could triumph over expedience, love over calculation, and hope over despair. For Isadora had discovered the most important truth of all, that no one could take away what truly mattered unless she chose to let them. And she had chosen, at last, to keep her heart for herself and give it freely to those who proved themselves worthy of the gift. The forsaken promise had become something far more precious. A freely given vow between equals, blessed by community and sanctified by justice. And in that transformation lay the seed of hope for all who would hear their story and remember that love, in the end, was always stronger than power.